The wind carried dust across the empty plains, and the sky above stretched wide with the quiet weight of a land that had seen too many battles between men and nature. The old American frontier was not a place of comfort, but one of survival. A lone cowboy rode slow along a narrow trail, his horse weary and ribs showing under its rough hide. The man had the look of someone who had traveled too far, seen too much, and carried it all in silence. His boots were cracked, his hat tilted low, and his eyes were half-shadowed, but anyone who glanced at him would sense he was not a drifter without purpose. There was a story buried under his silence, though he kept it to himself as if it were chained to his soul. He had crossed rivers that nearly swallowed him whole, mountains that tested his strength, and deserts where the sun seemed to burn the skin straight off a man's back. Yet it was not the land that wore him down most. It was the weight of memories, faces he could not forget, choices that haunted him. And now, after weeks of wandering with nothing but the sound of his own horse's hooves to keep him company, he longed for a roof over his head, a place where the night did not bite with cold, and the loneliness did not claw at his chest. When he finally came across a small settlement, it looked half forgotten by time. 3 cabins stood close together, weather-beaten and gray, their roofs patched with whatever scraps could be found. Smoke rose from one chimney, faint and struggling against the wind. There was no sound of children, no dogs barking, no men's voices carrying across the yards. Only silence, thick as the dust. He slowed his horse, his hand brushing the worn handle of his revolver, not because he expected trouble, but because the West had taught him to expect it anyway. The first sign of life came as he dismounted. A door creaked open, and a woman stepped out. She was tall, her face lined with years of hardship, yet there was a striking strength in her eyes. She looked at him not with fear, but with a kind of knowing. Behind her, another figure appeared, and then a third. 3 women stood in the doorways of those lonely cabins, all of them dressed in dark, faded clothes, all carrying the same look of survival. Widows, the cowboy thought. He had seen enough of them to recognize the grief etched into their movements, the way they held themselves as though carrying burdens too heavy to share. He tipped his hat in greeting, his voice low and polite. "Evenin', I'm just passin' through. Lookin' for a place to rest my horse, and maybe a floor to stretch out on, if you've got space." The first woman studied him as if weighing the truth in his words. The second folded her arms, her gaze sharper, less trusting. The third gave the faintest of smiles, though it was not warm. Something about the silence between them stretched longer than felt natural, and the cowboy felt the weight of it pressing on him. Finally, the eldest-looking woman spoke. "You'll find no men here, stranger, only us. Our husbands are buried not far from here. This land don't take kindly to those who aren't strong enough to fight it." He gave a slow nod. "I'm sorry to hear that. I mean no harm. Just a night's rest, that's all." The 3 widows exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing among them that the cowboy could not read. It left him uneasy. He had faced bandits on horseback, outlaws who carried rifles, and the lonely howls of coyotes circling in the dark. But the look in these women's eyes was something different. The second woman stepped forward, her voice steady. "You can rest here, but rest don't come free, not in this place. Everything's got a price." He shifted his weight, feeling the tension thicken around him. He had coin in his saddlebag, a few silver dollars left over from his last job driving cattle. "I can pay," he said quickly. Her eyes narrowed, and she shook her head. "Silver won't do. Food is scarce, and money won't fill our needs. You've got something else we want." The cowboy's jaw tightened. He did not like the tone, but he held his ground. And what would that be? It was the third woman who answered this time, her voice softer but cutting deeper. "You. We want you." His heart gave a hard thump in his chest. The words struck like a riddle, too direct and too strange to ignore. He had come for shelter, but what they asked was something altogether different. The first woman's eyes locked on his, her stare unflinching. "You must give yourself to us, cowboy. That's the only way you'll find rest under our roof." The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down like the sky itself. His breath came slow, his mind racing. He had walked into outlaw camps before, but never into anything like this. He could not tell if they were desperate, dangerous, or simply testing him. But one thing was clear. The choice was no longer simple. The cowboy's hand hovered near his side, not on his gun, but close enough. His horse shifted restlessly, sensing his unease. The widows stood firm, their faces pale but determined, their eyes locked on him, as if they had already decided his fate. He swallowed, the dry air catching in his throat. Something told him that whatever answer he gave now would change more than just the course of one night. It would tie him to their story, their pain, and perhaps something far darker than the land itself. The firelight flickered in the distance as the sky began to turn, the last colors of sunset bleeding away into night. The cowboy knew he had to decide whether to stay or ride on into the darkness. But with the widows standing there, their words still hanging in the air, he felt the weight of the frontier pressing closer than ever before. He opened his mouth to answer, but before he could, the eldest woman raised her hand. "Don't rush, cowboy. Think carefully. This is not a request. It's the only way." The wind howled low across the barren land, rattling the cabin doors. The cowboy felt his heart pounding as the moment stretched thin, like a rope pulled to the point of breaking. And then came the sound of a wolf in the distance, long and mournful, reminding him that night had truly come. He realized he was no longer certain whether stepping inside their cabin would save him from the cold or drag him into something he might never escape. He stood there, caught between his hunger for rest and the sharp edge of danger in their eyes, knowing that one step forward could change his fate forever. The cowboy stood silent in the fading light, his hat brim casting a shadow across his eyes as he studied the three widows. Their faces were calm, but there was something hard set behind their words, something that told him this was more than a simple bargain. He could feel the weight of the land pressing down on him, the emptiness of the plains stretching out in every direction, and in that silence their demand seemed even more unsettling. He had seen desperate people before, men who stole for bread and women who traded what they had just to keep their children alive. But this was different. These women had no fear in their tone, no pleading in their eyes. They spoke as if they held the power here, as if they knew he had nowhere else to go. The cowboy let his hand fall away from his side and turned his gaze toward the horizon where the last light of the day was giving way to night. His horse shifted again, restless and tired. He knew the animal needed food and water, maybe more than he needed rest himself. If he rode on, he might not find another shelter for days. He could risk the open land, but the night was cold and the wolves were already calling. His body ached for sleep, yet his instincts warned him not to step too quickly into the shadows of their cabins. The eldest widow stepped closer, her boots crunching on the dry earth. "You think we're testing you, don't you?" she said. "But this isn't a game. You're in our land now. If you want safety, you must pay our price." Her words carried a strange edge, not quite a threat, but not an invitation either. The cowboy studied her face, the lines carved deep from years of wind and worry. She had the look of someone who had buried more than just a husband. Her hands were rough, her eyes unyielding. The second woman, younger and sharper, crossed her arms and stared at him with a kind of challenge, while the third lingered near the doorway, her expression unreadable, almost as if she carried a secret the others didn't. He finally spoke, his voice steady but low. "You say I must give myself, but I need to know what you mean. I don't make deals blind." The women did not answer right away. Instead, the younger one gave a small laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Stranger, you'll learn soon enough. What matters is whether you're willing to stay the night." The cowboy's jaw tightened. He felt caught in a trap he hadn't seen coming. He had ridden for miles under the sun, chased by the silence of his own thoughts, only to find himself standing before three widows who spoke in riddles. Part of him wanted to mount his horse and ride until the dawn, but another part knew that if he did, the land might finish him before he ever saw another settlement. He glanced again at the cabins. The wood was worn thin, the windows patched with cloth, yet there was smoke rising from the chimney. That meant food, warmth, a fire to chase away the night. He could almost feel it already, though the cost was yet to be clear. The third woman finally stepped forward, her voice softer, almost gentle compared to the others. "We don't mean to frighten you, but you should understand, this place takes more than it gives. We've had to survive with no men, no help, nothing but each other. When someone stumbles our way, we must ask for what we need, not what they're willing to give." Her words carried a kind of sadness, and for a moment the cowboy felt a flicker of sympathy. He had known loneliness himself, the kind that hollowed a man out from the inside. Still, the demand unsettled him. He gave a slow nod, not promising anything, but not turning away either. "Gay." As the wind picked up, carrying the chill of night, the eldest woman spoke again. "Decide, cowboy. The dark is no friend to those who linger outside too long." The cowboy led his horse a few steps closer, stopping just short of the porch. "I'll take shelter," he said carefully, "but I need you to understand. I don't hand myself over without knowing what's asked of me. I'm no outlaw, no drifter looking to cause trouble. I'm just a man who's been riding too long." The women exchanged another look, one that told him his words hadn't changed their thoughts. But the eldest finally gave a small nod. "Then come inside. You'll see soon enough." He tied his horse to the post, gave the animal a final pat on the neck, and stepped toward the cabin. The air smelled of smoke and faintly of stew, though the scent was thin, as if stretched to feed mouths that went hungry more often than not. Inside, the light of the fire flickered against the walls, throwing shadows that made the small room seem larger than it was. The floor was bare, the table worn, and the chairs mismatched, but it was shelter all the same. The cowboy removed his hat, brushing dust from the brim, and stood near the fire. The warmth seeped into his bones, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to feel the relief of it. But the unease never left. The three women moved about the cabin with quiet purpose, one setting out bowls, another tending the pot, the third watching him as if trying to read his every thought. He took note of the small details: the rifle propped against the wall, the scars in the wood where a knife had been struck more than once, the absence of laughter that usually filled homes, even in hard times. Everything here spoke of survival, but also of loss. Finally, the younger widow placed a bowl before him. "Eat," she said simply. He sat, the chair creaking under his weight, and lifted the spoon. The stew was thin, mostly broth with a few scraps of meat and root vegetables, but it was hot, and it settled the hunger gnawing at his gut. As he ate, he kept his eyes on the women. None of them touched their bowls until he had nearly finished, and even then, they ate sparingly, as if every bite mattered. When the meal was done, the eldest leaned forward, folding her hands on the table. "You'll sleep here tonight. But remember what we said, nothing comes free." The cowboy nodded slowly, setting the spoon down. "Understand. But you'll have to be clearer before I give any promise." The room went quiet again, the only sound, the crackle of the fire. The three women looked at him in turn, their eyes steady, their faces unreadable. Finally, the younger one broke the silence. "Rest first, cowboy. We'll speak more when the time is right." Her words did not ease him. They only deepened the mystery. He knew there was more to their demand than they had said, and he could feel the truth pressing just beyond his reach, like a shadow waiting for the light to die. As he lay down on the blanket they gave him near the fire, he kept one hand close to his revolver. His eyes drifted to the rafters above, where the wood creaked softly with the wind. Sleep tugged at him, but the unease never left. He felt the weight of their eyes still on him, even as the fire burned low. The widows moved quietly in the other room, their voices hushed, carrying words he could not catch. He closed his eyes but did not let himself drift fully into sleep. He knew the night still held its secrets, and he had stepped into a place where shelter came at a cost he had yet to understand. The howl of the wolf returned, closer this time, and the cowboy's grip on his revolver tightened. He knew the wilderness was full of dangers. But in that moment, he wasn't sure if the greater danger was outside in the dark or inside under the roof of three widows, who had asked for something he still did not fully grasp. As the fire dimmed and the cabin settled into silence, the cowboy's mind circled the same question over and over. What did they truly want from him, and what would happen when the time came to pay the price? The answer lingered just out of reach, leaving him restless on the edge of sleep. Knowing dawn would not bring him peace, but only the next step into their hidden world. The cowboy woke before dawn, though he wasn't sure he had truly slept at all. The fire had burned down 2 glowing embers, and the cabin was heavy with the stillness of night. He could hear the faint sound of breathing from the other room where the 3 widows slept, but even that seemed too quiet, too careful. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the boards creak under the weight of the wind, and wondering what it was that kept him from closing his eyes fully. His body needed rest, but his mind refused it. When the first hint of gray touched the sky outside, he rose and pulled on his boots. His horse snorted softly at the post, and he stepped outside to check on it. The air was sharp with cold, and the land stretched out, empty and endless. He had ridden across miles of country like this, where a man could disappear without leaving more than a trail of dust. Yet something about this place felt heavier, as if the ground itself carried secrets. He rubbed the horse's neck and glanced back at the cabins. Smoke was just beginning to rise again, thin and pale against the dawn. A figure moved in the doorway, and he saw the eldest widow watching him. She didn't speak, didn't even raise a hand, only studied him with those steady eyes before turning back inside. The silence left behind was louder than words. By the time he re-entered the cabin, a pot of coffee was on the stove. The younger widow moved about the room with quick, sharp motions, her face tight as if she were already annoyed with him, though he had said nothing. The third was quieter, her hands steady as she sliced what little bread they had. Together they looked like women bound not only by grief, but by something unspoken that held them tighter than blood. The cowboy sat at the table, and the eldest set a cup in front of him. "You slept light," she said, though it sounded more like a statement than a question. "I've learned too," he answered simply. The younger one gave a short laugh, not out of humor, but as if she had expected no less. "A man who sleeps heavy out here don't last long." He sipped the coffee, bitter but warming. "You've lived here long then?" he asked, though his tone was careful, probing. The eldest gave a slow nod, long enough to know what it takes, long enough to know men don't stay. The words lingered in the air, and the cowboy felt the weight of them. He thought of his own past, of the people he had left behind, the graves he had ridden away from. He knew the truth of it, that the land claimed more than it ever gave. But something in her voice told him there was more to the story than simple hardship. As the morning stretched on, he tried to offer help. He carried wood, fetched water, and tended to the small patch of ground they called a garden, though it seemed more dust than soil. The widows accepted his labor without thanks, but without protest either. It was as though they had already expected him to take on the work, as though his presence was part of some plan already set in motion. While he worked, he noticed small details that unsettled him. A set of tools leaned against one cabin wall, rusted from disuse, though clearly meant for a man's hand. A child's shoe half buried in the dirt near the steps. Crosses on a hill not far off, too many for a place so small. Each sign was a reminder that these women had lived through more loss than most could bear, yet they stood unbroken, hardened in a way that made them difficult to read. At midday, while the sun burned high and the land shimmered with heat, the cowboy found himself walking with the third widow. She was quieter than the others, her steps slower, her gaze softer. She led him toward the edge of the property where a small creek cut through the land, its water running shallow but clear. She knelt and dipped her hands into the stream, letting the water run over her fingers. "You wonder why we asked what we did?" she said, her voice low but steady. The cowboy studied her profile, the sadness etched in her features. "I do," he admitted. She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "This land takes everything. It leaves us with nothing but the need to hold on to what little we can. When men pass through, they come and go, leaving us no stronger than before. We ask because we must, not because we wish to." Her words carried honesty, but also a weight that hinted at something more. The cowboy felt a pang of sympathy, but it was tangled with unease. He didn't press her further, not yet. He knew there were truths buried here, but they would not be given freely. Back at the cabins, the eldest widow was speaking with the younger in hushed tones. Their voices were sharp, tense, though he could not catch the words. When they saw him, they fell silent, their eyes hard on him until he turned away. That night, the air grew colder, and the fire burned brighter. The widows moved with a kind of rhythm, preparing the room, closing the shutters, locking the doors. The cowboy noticed how carefully they barred the windows, how they checked each latch twice. It was not the way of people who feared only the cold. It was the way of people who feared something else entirely. As he lay on his blanket, the sound of the wind outside was broken by another noise. Faint at first, but growing clearer. Hooves, distant, but approaching. His hand went instinctively to his revolver, and he rose, moving to the window. The eldest widow was already there, her face pale in the firelight. She pressed a finger to her lips, silencing him, then pulled the curtain tighter. "Stay quiet," she whispered. The hooves grew louder, then stopped just beyond the edge of the property. The cowboy's heart thudded in his chest as he listened. Voices carried on the wind. Men's voices, rough and low. He could not make out the words, but he recognized the tone. "Outlaws." The younger widow cursed under her breath, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the table. The third stood near the fire, her face frozen with fear. The eldest remained calm, though her eyes flicked toward the door, toward the rifle leaning against the wall. The cowboy whispered, "Who are they?" The eldest's voice was steady, but cold. "Men who've come before. Men who think they can take what they want. We've turned them away before, but they keep coming back." The cowboy felt his blood run hot. He had dealt with men like that, men who thought the weak were theirs for the taking. He could feel the tension in the room tighten like a noose. The widows had asked for his help in a way he still didn't understand, but now he saw the truth of their fear. They were alone against a world that did not forgive weakness. The voices outside grew louder, closer. A fist pounded on the door, hard enough to rattle the frame. The cowboy's hand gripped his revolver, his body tense, ready. The widows looked at him, their faces caught between desperation and determination. The eldest spoke again, her voice low and sharp. "You see why nothing comes free here. You wanted rest, cowboy. But rest don't come without a fight." The pounding on the door came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of laughter outside. The fire flickered, shadows stretching across the walls, and the cowboy knew the night was about to test them all. He stood with the revolver drawn, his eyes fixed on the door. The widows moved around him, each with her own kind of resolve. The eldest reached for the rifle. The younger grabbed a blade from the table, and the third clutched a lantern with shaking hands. The door shuddered under another blow, and the laughter outside turned to shouts. The cowboy felt the weight of the moment press down on him. He had come seeking shelter, but what he had found was a fight waiting in the dark, a fight that was not his, but one he could not walk away from. The widows had told him he must give himself, And now he began to understand. They were not asking only for his body, not only for his presence. They were asking for his strength, his will, his willingness to stand with them against whatever haunted their nights. The pounding stopped suddenly, leaving the silence heavier than before. The cowboy's finger rested on the trigger, his breath steady. The widows stood at his side, their faces lit by firelight, their eyes sharp with fear and fury. Then a voice outside called out, low and mocking, "Open the door, ladies. We know you're in there. We know you've got company tonight." The cowboy felt the cold of the metal in his hand, the heat of the fire at his back, and the weight of 3 women who had demanded his strength as their price. He knew the night had only begun, and whatever happened next would bind him to this place in ways he could not yet see. The voice outside carried across the night like a knife scraping against stone. It was followed by another round of laughter, deeper this time, rough with the kind of menace that made a man's skin prickle. The cowboy stood steady, revolver in hand, his eyes fixed on the door that shook under the weight of fists demanding entry. The widows stood with him, their faces pale but unyielding, each one holding whatever weapon they could find. The air inside the cabin was tight, the heat from the fire pressing down against the cold creeping in through the cracks in the walls. The eldest widow's voice cut through the silence like steel. "Don't move unless I tell you." They're waiting for weakness. The cowboy didn't answer. He kept his body still, his finger resting on the trigger, every muscle ready to spring. He could hear the shuffle of boots outside, the snorts of horses, the sound of men shifting their weight as though preparing for more than talk. He had seen this before: gangs of men who thought numbers made them invincible, who preyed on the isolated because no lawman was near enough to stop them. Another voice joined the first, louder, sharper. "You've hidden long enough. Open this door, or we'll burn you out." The younger widow gripped her knife tighter, her jaw clenched. "They won't stop," she whispered. "They never do." The third widow stood close to the cowboy, the lantern trembling in her hands. He glanced at her and saw fear plain on her face, but also something else: trust. As if she had already decided that he was the one thing standing between them and ruin. The cowboy's mind raced. He could step outside now, face the men head-on, try to scare them off with the kind of calm a gunfighter carried. But he knew men like this. They weren't the sort to be frightened away by a single revolver. If anything, they'd test his aim, test his resolve, and they'd enjoy it. The eldest widow raised the rifle and moved closer to the door. "They've been circling us for months," she said, her voice low and steady. "Always testing, always waiting. Tonight, they must believe we've weakened. That's why they came." The cowboy's jaw tightened. "Or they know I'm here," he said. The words hung heavy in the air. The widows exchanged quick glances, each one reflecting the same thought. If the men outside knew about him, it meant they were watching closer than anyone realized. It meant nothing inside these walls was truly safe. A rock struck the window, shattering one of the patched panes. The younger widow jumped but didn't scream. The cowboy turned his gun toward the noise, but the eldest widow pulled his arm back down. "Don't waste a bullet on shadows," she said sharply. The voices outside swelled with laughter, cruel and mocking. One man called out, "Come on now, let us in. We'll make it worth your while." Another answered with a curse, the sound of spitting on the ground. Then came the creak of leather, the metallic clink of rifles being readied. The cowboy's heartbeat steadied, slow and sure. He had learned long ago that fear killed faster than bullets. He glanced at the widows, each one holding their ground, though the firelight revealed the strain in their eyes. He thought of the crosses on the hill, of the tools rusting in the dirt, of the way these women had spoken of men who never stayed. Suddenly, he understood. These widows weren't simply survivors, they were defenders of ground that others wanted to claim. Ground soaked with loss and guarded by desperation. The pounding on the door came again, harder, shaking the frame. The eldest widow lifted the rifle, her voice cold as winter. "You'll die before you step foot in this house." The laughter outside turned into a chorus of jeers. One voice rose above the rest. "We'll see about that." The cowboy's mind raced. He had seen standoffs before, and he knew how quickly words turned to blood. He scanned the cabin, the walls thin, the windows patched, the roofs sagging. This place was not built to withstand a fight. It was a shelter, not a fortress. If the men outside truly meant to break in, it would not take them long. He moved closer to the eldest widow, his voice low but urgent. "If we hold here, they'll burn us out. They've got numbers. We need another way." Her eyes flicked toward him, sharp and assessing. "Then speak, cowboy. What's your way?" He thought fast. "The creek. The ground dips there. If we move, we can use the shadows, maybe flank them." The younger widow shook her head, her voice hard. "Leave this house and we lose everything. This is all we have." The third widow stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "If we stay, we lose more than the house, and we lose ourselves." The room went quiet, the only sound the men outside circling like wolves. The cowboy felt the moment tighten, as though the walls themselves were closing in. He knew they could not argue long. The outlaws would not wait forever. A sudden flare of fire outside caught his eye. Through the cracks, he saw torchlight. His stomach sank. They weren't bluffing. They meant to burn the place. The cowboy stepped back, his revolver steady. "It's decided then. We fight, but not trapped inside. If we're going down, we'll face them in the open." The eldest widow studied him for a long moment, then gave a short nod. "So be it." The younger widow's eyes blazed with fury, but she did not argue. She adjusted her grip on the knife and muttered, "Then let's make them bleed for every inch." The third widow tightened her hold on the lantern, her face pale, but her jaw set. The cowboy moved quickly, pushing the table toward the door, creating a barrier. He gestured for the widows to follow him, toward the back, where a small door led out to the rear of the cabin. The torchlight outside flickered, shadows moving across the walls, the voices growing louder. They slipped out into the night, the cold air biting hard. The cowboy led the way, his revolver raised, his eyes scanning the dark. The widows moved close behind, silent but steady. The land stretched before them, vast and merciless, but the creek was near, its shallow waters glinting faintly in the moonlight. Behind them, the outlaws shouted, realizing the cabin was emptying. The sound of boots thundered against the porch, fists hammering against the door, laughter breaking into curses. The firelight grew brighter, flames licking at the dry wood. The cowboy pushed the widows down the slope toward the creek, his own body tense and ready. He could hear the men giving chase now, their voices eager, hungry for the hunt. As they reached the shadows of the creek, the cowboy crouched low, his breath steady. He glanced at the widows, their eyes wide but resolute. "Stay low," he whispered. "Wait for my mark." The sound of hooves and boots drew nearer, the glow of torches breaking through the night. The cowboy tightened his grip on the revolver, his heartbeat steady, his mind clear. He knew the next moments would decide everything. The widows pressed close, their faces lit faintly by the flames climbing behind them, their weapons clutched tight. The air was filled with the smell of smoke, the crackle of fire, the shouts of men closing in. The cowboy crouched deeper in the shadows, waiting, every muscle coiled. The outlaws were almost upon them now, their laughter cutting through the night, their torches casting long, flickering shadows across the ground. The widows looked to him, their eyes full of fear and defiance. The cowboy inhaled slowly, the cold air burning his lungs. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down, the choice between survival and death balanced on a knife's edge. The first outlaw's torchlight broke over the rise, casting its glow on the creek bed. The cowboy's finger tightened on the trigger, his jaw set. He knew there was no turning back now. The night had become a battlefield, and the moment of reckoning was only a breath away. The torchlight spilled across the creek bed. The first outlaw stepped into view, rifle in hand, his grin wide and cruel. Behind him came two more, their boots crunching on the dry ground, their laughter echoing like hyenas in the night. The cowboy waited in the shadows, every nerve taut, every breath controlled. The widows crouched close behind him, their weapons clutched tightly, their faces pale in the glow of fire. The outlaw raised his torch higher, the flames flickering across the land. "Come on out now," he called, his voice sharp with confidence. "Ain't no use hiding. We'll find you, one way or another." The cowboy did not move. He waited until the men stepped closer, until the torchlight almost reached the water's edge. Then he rose, revolver raised, his stance firm as stone. The shot rang out sharp and clean, breaking the night like thunder. The torch fell, sputtering in the shallow water, and the first outlaw crumpled without a sound. Chaos erupted. The other men shouted, ducking low, their rifles snapping up. The cowboy fired again, his aim steady, forcing them back. The eldest widow took her place at his side. The rifle braced against her shoulder. She fired once, the echo carrying across the plains, and another man fell. The younger widow leaped forward with a cry, her knife flashing in the firelight as she caught one outlaw off guard. The third widow swung the lantern high, its glass shattering, flames scattering across the dirt and forcing the others to retreat. The fight raged hard and fast, but the cowboy's resolve did not waver. He had faced outlaws before, men who lived off fear and blood, but never with this weight on his shoulders. He was not fighting for gold, nor for pride, but for three women who had stood against the darkness long before he had arrived. When the smoke cleared and the shouting faded, the ground was littered with silence. A few outlaws fled into the night, their torches vanishing into the black horizon. The rest lay still by the creek, their laughter silenced forever. The cowboy lowered his revolver, his chest heaving, sweat and dust clinging to his skin. The eldest widow still held the rifle, her hand steady, though her face revealed the years of weight pressing down on her. The younger stood tall, her knife dripping, her breath ragged but fierce. The third widow knelt on the ground, her lantern gone, her eyes wide with shock, but still alive. The cowboy's horse stamped nervously nearby, the sound breaking the silence that followed the fight. The fire from the cabin glowed behind them, still burning, its smoke curling into the night sky. The widows turned to look, sorrow in their faces. Their home, weathered and patched though it was, had been claimed by flames. The eldest spoke first, her voice calm though heavy. "The house can be rebuilt. We're still breathing, and that's what matters." The younger spat into the dirt, her eyes blazing. "They'll come again. Men like that don't stop. Not unless someone makes them." The cowboy holstered his revolver, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. He knew she was right. Outlaws didn't forgive. They didn't forget. And word would spread of what had happened here. This place, these women, would never know peace so long as the land drew men who thought it was theirs for the taking. The third widow rose slowly, her voice trembling. "Then what now? We can't live in ashes. We can't run forever." The cowboy looked at them each in turn. They had lost much already, and yet they still stood. He thought of the graves on the hill, of the silence that clung to this land, of the years that had shaped them into something stronger than sorrow. He understood then what their demand had meant from the start. When they had told him he must give himself, it was not just his body they sought. It was his strength, his will, his choice to stand beside them when others had walked away. He removed his hat, turning it slowly in his hands. "I came here looking for rest," he said quietly. "But maybe what I needed was a reason not to keep drifting. If you'll have me, I'll stay. I'll help you rebuild. I'll fight alongside you if they come again." The eldest studied him, her eyes sharp as ever, weighing his words as though testing for weakness. Finally, she gave a slow nod. "Then you're welcome here. But know this, Cowboy, our lives are not simple. This land will test you, same as it tested us." The younger crossed her arms, her mouth set in a thin line. "If you stay, you fight. No second thoughts. No running when it gets too hard." The third gave him the faintest smile, a flicker of hope breaking through her fear. "If you stay, maybe this place won't feel so empty anymore." The cowboy placed his hat back on his head and looked once more at the horizon. The sky was beginning to pale with the first hints of dawn, the night giving way to morning. He felt the weight of choice heavy on his shoulders, but for the first time in years, it did not feel like a burden. It felt like a purpose. Together, they turned back toward the burning remains of the cabin. The widows stood close, their faces marked by loss, but lit with determination. The cowboy stood with them, his shadow falling long across the dirt. They would rebuild. They would defend what was theirs. And he would not ride away this time. As the sun rose higher, the smoke from the fire curled into the sky, a signal to anyone watching from afar that this land was not abandoned, not broken, and not without defenders. The widows had found their strength in each other, and now in the cowboy. They had found someone willing to share their fight. The graves on the hill bore silent witness to what had been lost, but below, life stirred again. The land was harsh, the nights long, the dangers constant, but together they would endure. For in the old American frontier, survival was never promised, it was claimed by those willing to stand and fight for it. The cowboy, once a drifter with no home, now felt the weight of belonging settle in his chest. The widows, once alone against the world, now stood with someone who had chosen to stay. Their paths, carved by loss and hardship, had crossed in fire and blood. But from that crossing came a bond that neither the land nor the outlaws could break. As the day broke full and clear, the cowboy took one last look at the horizon. It was still vast, still endless, still calling to men like him to wander. But for now, he turned away from it. His place was here, among three widows who had asked for everything, and who had given him more in return than he thought he still deserved. The story of their survival would not be written in gold or glory, but in grit, in fire, and in the unyielding will to endure. And as the sun rose higher, casting its light over the burned cabin, the graves, and the living who stood together, the cowboy knew one truth above all. Rest was never given freely on this land. It had to be fought for, and now he was ready to fight.